I'm going to get the chat here. All right.
Well, welcome everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, James Russell, for this presentation. James is started in January as our Senior Director for Research Support and Assurance, and I am excited that he's going to be presenting on an important project that describes how Unizin is doing some incredible work supporting cross-institutional research. So James, it's over to you.
Thank you, Etienne. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for being here. Again, I'm James Russell, Senior Director for Research Support and Assurance for Unizin. Before I start, I'm going to just pay homage a little bit to my esteemed colleague, Etienne. I'd like to first thank him for really conceiving and building the foundation for this cross-institutional research process. Etienne really brought the workflow and documentation together, so I am riding on his due diligence and efforts here, and will attempt to represent the best I can. Additionally, I'd like to thank the Research Advisory Committee for their work in tandem with Etienne, and I think in bringing to life what is really an important complement to the UDP. And finally, I've got the chat open. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in there and I'll answer them as we go, or if I miss them, I will certainly address them at the end. But either way, welcome your feedback and questions. So what problem are we trying to solve in this process of facilitating cross-institutional research? In my view, it's to seamlessly leverage the diversity of big data, which exists, but at scale, so to the nth power across member institutions. So if we look at a high level at the unique data that streams to the UDP, potentially millions of events per day, and understand that this is carried out for all member institutions in largely the same way, and that the architecture of the UDP necessarily keeps these data stores isolated from one another, we have the infrastructure and technical foundation for a tremendous amount of learning data, really bringing new institutional contexts into play when we think cross or multi-institutionally. And we can do that if we can employ governance around sharing that data. So this is really what we're after. What we are looking to implement is a process driven by governance to best exploit the depth and breadth of context and event data that exists in the UDP across multiple institutions. So in sum, we need to match governance with what we have accomplished through IT infrastructure. So maybe a more functional and leads into kind of dissecting this process a bit is we want to standardize the administrative and technical steps through governance in support of original cross-institutional research among Unizin members. And in many respects, that's going to be my role in implementing this governance. So as I see it, this governance is built on a foundation of three primary elements. We have Unizin data platform as an IT infrastructure providing a unique set of data services. We have the Unizin charge, which could be described to assist member-affiliated researchers to conduct research and statistical projects involving the best uses of student data for improving educational processes and outcomes. And we have agreements established generally as general and security controls as described by our agreements. All of this upon which a governance model should sit, and that should be transparent, authoritative, and determined by controls, and most importantly, in all of this, institutional engagement. And finally, as the top layer, operationalize it as a service. We want to operationalize this governance, and we, in my view, do it through these four areas: institutional representation, what we want institutions in concert with agreements to have the final word on each use case involving their data, realize the consortium potential, which is to fully utilize across institutions consortium level data, expedite, of course, original research, and to make the UDP as accessible as possible, and then weave confidentiality and security throughout. That is, ensure confidentiality at every stage, from really agreements to operations. So this process, as one of those foundational elements, is built on established agreements. The first is the member services agreement, and that entitles a member institution to Unizin's technology solutions, including the UDP. It also allows Unizin to collect data on behalf of an institution. So this establishes Unizin's role as a school official and its rights, roles, and responsibilities around accessing and managing an institution's FERPA data. The other agreement is the data sharing agreement, which enables Unizin to not only collect that data on behalf of an institution, institution, but to share it across member institutions. And as part of the due diligence inherent in Unizin's role, the necessity of this governance and process, in my view, is implicated in the spirit of the data sharing agreement. So what I mean by that is that we absolutely have to have data sharing agreements in place for this cross-institutional process to have weight, to have legal authority. But at the same time, we won't implement or ride on that agreement without the inclusivity of this governance, which means rich involvement of the institution and ultimately a vetting of the research and the data being shared, unless we have sign off from that institution. It really is a conjunction of two processes: the processes that we're building around governance that mediates researcher and participating, lending, as it were, institutions, and the data sharing agreement. Those are both integral to this process. So a few key predicates just before we move into the details. Again, Unizin will steward this process between member institutions. That's my role. It's intended for pre and post award research. So we encourage the formal process of research, whether pre or post award, and which may or may not lead to formal external funding opportunities, but should lead to publication. So we want to encourage all forms of research. It's built again on member services and data service sharing agreements, defines Unizin as a school official with FERPA agency with a legitimate need and purpose to access, manage student data for member institutions. There are concrete imperatives to protect PII, and stipulates that Unizin provides de-identified data for cross-institutional research, for which we have a documented process. And again, this rides on a single tenant architecture. That is, any multi-institutional data set would be generated as a distinct and separate data service, and that Unizin maintains the sequestered nature of institutional data. And then finally, it relies on at least 2 dedicated data stewards, Unizin defined data stewards. So institutions may have their own data management council or data managers at their institution. They may be called data stewards. We have dedicated data stewards that understand our process, and we would work with them in this assessment process regarding sharing their institution's data. So there are 4 phases in this process. First of which is to distribute and gather required documentation. Submit, once we have a final package of signed and understood documentation, submit that for review at each institution, sharing data. Now we have the internal part to Unizin, which is generate data and metadata and documentation around that proposal and request. And then hopefully this all leads to publication of research and distribution of research findings. So phase one would include then a data requirements template, and this is really the basis upon which Unizin makes its assessment of the applicability of the data request. Does it fit the UDP and what Unizin collects and so forth? And then we have a data management plan that may or may not be applicable to the researchers depending on if external funding is involved at this particular stage, but does provide useful information at a summary level. Unizin's research and confidentiality agreement, which must be signed. Cross-institutional data security training document, which has some acknowledgement of some local or institutional data security. And then the contingent Unizin approval letter that would go to IRB based on their approval of the research. So step one, data requirements template. This is conveyed to Unizin, as I said, prior to contingent approval and gives us an idea of what constitutes the research, what it's about. We have grant name and project name, research analysis plan, discussion of methods. We might have an open science framework, OSF project page, especially if not associated with a grant proposal. We'd had a research analysis plan and discussion of methods in that context. Participating institutions, and it's very likely that these participating institutions are represented by the researchers listed below, and that oftentimes is the case, that we already have a relationship between institutions and researchers working on similar methods or similar topics. So we would collect those, as well as Unizin contact for data acquisition. That would be someone in my team. Comprehensive description of the data required, and then custom measures required or gaps identified. Are there specific demographics that might be part of an institution's SIS, or is there a need for course numbers to be targeted? And then with that, we would have the primary approval piece that Unizin takes part in, and that would be indicated within the data requirements template. Document 2, or step 2, is the data management plan. And really, if moving forward toward external funding, the template provides really all the key information for external funding proposals around the UDP and Unizin's role in data management. So we have a broad discussion of UDP learner and learning environment data, the legal foundation for sharing data, that Unizin discloses data only for the purposes of the research use case and for which the data request was approved. We have procedures for maintaining confidentiality in place, elucidated within that template, an outline of security controls that has discussion of UDP's single tenant architecture again, application of encryption at every phase of data management, and our de-identification process. And then roles and responsibilities of determining and preparing the data. And this is, for the most part, delivered through the previous data requirements template. But that really includes how the data will be formatted, validated, delivered, de-identified, etc. And then really underscores the final piece, necessary agreements in place, underscores the data sharing and confidentiality agreements that need to be in place, both signed by the institution, of course, as a prerequisite for this entire process to happen, and by the researcher in terms of responsible and aware in terms of confidentiality they are in using Unizin data. 3, then again, signing this research and confidentiality agreement, this really is an obligation on the researcher's side for each PI or researcher to maintain 1, confidentiality, and 2, to disseminate the fruits of their research. So in this way, PIs must agree to comply with privacy rules, commit to public dissemination of research findings, that study courses above a cell cohort threshold, so that, for example, no individual student can be identified, and then generally securely handle all data delivered by Unizin, treating it as confidential information. Step 4 is the cross-institutional data security training document, and that is probably the most recent of all components to this process. In essence, it's how do we ensure researchers working with an institution's data are appropriately trained and utilize best practices in the use of data. Another question might be, how do we harmonize different institutional approaches to training around data security so that institutions feel confident that PIs or researchers have an understanding of appropriate security controls. In reality, Unizin can neither control the local IT infrastructure nor the data security training within each institution. That was a thought for about 5 minutes in terms of what we might be able to do to harmonize IT security policy across all member institutions, and within that, try to encompass data security training that would address the unique dispositions, however similar and however fundamentally the same, of data security policy and security policy in general at each institution. The other trick there is some institutions bring training together in different ways. They might amalgamate security training or separate from HIPAA to FERPA to acceptable use to HR. So what we've tried to do in an effort to fulfill an institution's valid requests that researchers at other institutions are as aware and as trained and cognizant of data security as they might be, we tried to make this as transparent as possible. And so we've done a couple of things. We've created a document that asks researchers to work with local IT professionals and review appropriate IT policies to secure data, understand what are the constraints, how IT policy is formulated, how it's connected to data security, how data classification works, and make sure that they are fully aware of the expectations at their institution. Oftentimes, that's the missing link. The other is to provide an accounting of local IT training and certification. So where the institution from where I came, we had a separate HIPAA training, we had separate FERPA, we had an acceptable use agreement that said where we could store things, what kind of resources we could utilize at the university in pursuit of various activities. All of these instruments were separate. Whatever it is, we would like researchers to bring to the table what their institution requires in terms of data security training. And then within the document, we have recommended best practices. So these are practices that are probably not unique to any institution that govern, if you're going to be working with Unizin data locally, what are the kinds of things that you would think about for any data that would be restricted or critical or considered sensitive. So everything from access control to where to store it, to change and logging and so forth. And those practices really should come through discussion with IT professionals in step one. And then as an added component, I am positioned again to steward concerns, to broker conversations around harmonizing different ideas or different expressions, probably more than real substantial differences in IT security policy, and if there are questions or concerns. So again, having Unizin become part of not the decision-making process, and I think this is an important distinction, but the deliberative process to mediate concerns and help find common understanding around institutional security protocols and concerns here is key. And I think this kind of mediation throughout the process is really central to the service that we're building. And finally, the contingent approval letter, and this is based primarily on the dataset requirements template that we received initially. And Unizin will grant contingent approval based on what Unizin, again, is positioned to review for PIs or researchers to convey to their IRB. And just for some background, certainly in accordance with FDA regulations, an IRB has the authority to approve or require modifications in or disapprove research, in particular around the treatment of human subjects in research. And again, so we look for IRB approval or exemption required, outlines Unizin's role in data delivery that's also in the dataset requirements template, and then once again expresses expectations around publishing findings. So at the end of this, these steps, Unizin should be in a position to have the full understanding of the research proposal, grant proposal, through research materials and OSF project page. So we have a document or link. We should have a signed confidentiality agreement for every PI participating in this process. We should also have a completed cross-institutional data security training document completed for each researcher PI. We should have then a CITI module training, that's research ethics and compliance training, and that the grant PIs would provide Unizin with links to the CTI program certifications, demonstrating their training for the human subjects protection, the HSP, and responsible conduct of research, and make sure that that's up to date. And then finally, the IRB approval or exemption based on our information that we have helped provide. And once that is in place, then we have our data set requirements form, which is also completed. That should be the full package of materials necessary to then provide for review, plus Unizin's now non-contingent approval letter. It is now fully vetted, and we move to data stewards. So key outcomes here. We're really, again, looking to address, to steward the process between PIs and researchers and institutions. This is the real value. And this is again, greases the runway between the minutia of administrative process and the broader governance concerns of having institutions have a say in, ultimately, in how their data is used. These are integral to this process. And removing faculty from flailing, or researchers or PIs from flailing in this process and accumulating documents and getting the necessary sign off without structure is an enormous encumbrance, and ultimately doesn't serve our aims to move research toward productively exploiting and using UDP data. Mediate if necessary. So address and help mediate concerns. Are there concerns around, for example, keeping institutions anonymous in publication of data? Or are there concerns around data training or methods used? These are the kinds of things that would be decision points for an institution to either work with the researchers and PIs, or decide that this is not an appropriate use of their data. But again, ultimately, it is their choice. So in essence, once all of these pieces are in play, and that we hope we don't have concerns, all obstacles for cross-institutional sharing of data are cleared, and we are liberated to move toward the fun part and what we do know and do well, and that's data generation and delivery. So in terms of creating a document that appropriately logs queries, that again looks at which member UDP instances queries were run, records who executed the queries and the resulting data set, and then data is delivered in an agreement format, an agreed format and location as per the data requirements template. And then ideally, of course, we have researchers share publications with Unizin, disseminate to participating institutions. That's certainly important. And then if we can, have a persistent link through OSF or through scholarly data archives that Indiana University has, or other archives that would maintain a record for public review and sharing of the research. So summary. We want to really give institutions, again, final say in how and when their data is used. We want to remove administrative impediments from this process and steward the approval process between PIs, researchers, and institutions. We want, then that leads to the facilitation of the use of UDP data. And then ultimately, and something we're really kind of in our nascency, is building an archive and document of UDP dependent research. This is really important, not only for attracting new members, but for really communicating the research value proposition of Unizin and the tremendous value that it can provide. So next steps, I see two. First is test our process, and we haven't had a fully engaged process yet with multiple institutions. We need to test, we need to identify gaps in the workflow where our communication might be lagging, additions of documentation. I think this is essential to really making this service mature. We need a use case, we need some empirical data, and hopefully over the next month or two we'll have that. The other piece to me is as important, and that is establish guidelines and best practices with Unizin data stewards. I think we need to clearly define roles and expectations around this review process with institutional data stewards. How do we accommodate an institution's potential interest in reviewing the relative merits of research for which the data is requested? So I think we really need to define some mechanisms and formal processes of documentation necessary for data stewards to create these reviews and feel like if they have to involve other members at their university, researchers and so forth, that they have a structure to work within. So and I think that will come fairly quickly in collaboration with those data stewards. But I think it's absolutely elemental to set them up for success in the review. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for joining, and would love to take comments or questions. Let me just stop sharing here so I can see everyone. And I will implicate Etienne in this in answering any questions that I may not have the knowledge or understanding of. Is there perchance a institutional data steward here in the audience? I don't want to put anyone on the spot. All right.
Well, this is Jeff from Minnesota, and we're starting to look at our process right now in terms of now that the UDP is a reality. We've got our SAS data flowing, and we're kind of priming the pump for some initiatives. Like I say, we're just starting this probably next week, starting to build our process. As it seems very thorough to me what you're describing, and I'm used to vetting learning tools, and that can take months to sometimes years if the right people don't weigh in on that. This is kind of new grounds for me. If everything runs well, is this overly burdensome, or is this typically what it takes to get access to data? I'm just curious on your opinions about that.
Right. Well, it sounds, in many respects, it sounds like what you do is what I did in my prior life, which was around what we call the software services and selection process.
Right.
So anything that was purchased with university funds had to go through this process. And if it touched institutional data, it had to be reviewed. It could be expedited if it was what we classified as university internal. If it was restricted or critical, so if there was, rarely was it critical, but if it involved FERPA data, that would be restricted. Right. We needed to involve HECVAT and multiple service providers to look at it and say, okay, first of all, how much are we paying for it? Is there a competing application out there? And how does it integrate with institutional information, institutional data? That could take days or months.
I got it.
It depends. But I think as Etienne and I were discussing in another topic, is that the devil's in the details, and it can either liberate you or stymie you. And so I do think that each case is nuanced, and part of the process is that, and why we're implementing this is that, so we have the data sharing agreements, which has a fairly blanket statement. As we know, we could do the same thing with software, but every use case determines. Right. You might have the same software title hitting data in two different ways. So I think we have to be sensitive. And what I was alluding to is how how do we better structure conversations that we would have with data stewards at institutions to say, here's our expectations. Here's kind of a framework for decision making. And here's what you might do or think about if you hit a roadblock, if there's a real concern. And I think that some of that is going to take conversations at your institution too. I think some institutions may be more concerned with having data describing their institutions than others, for example. And we need to be sensitive to that. We need to take that into consideration. So while I want to develop a bit more of a structure, I think it's going to be a case-by-case decision process.
Cool.
And
probably learn over time, right? As things flow through the process, it'll become evident where we can take different steps, right?
That's right, and that ideally we have very likely principal investigators coming from that institution. So in a way, we can use those PIs and those researchers at the lending institution to give us insights into the research if there are questions, insights into the data if there are questions. Perhaps persuasion in terms of working with other faculty to validate the assessment. So it becomes a very nuanced process. Thanks for the question.
I'll throw one more out there. So
sure.
I want to do a cross-institutional research. I would love these 5 schools to participate. Is that how I would go about it? I would actually say I want to include these 5 schools, and then 4 of them might say yes, or all 5 might say yes. Is that
Yes.
kind of the process?
Okay. Yeah. And again, I suspect that most cross-institutional research folks will work with researchers at those institutions that will be lending the data, right? They'll have a researcher there. Not all, certainly there will be a variety of ways of doing this, but I suspect that someone at University X has been working on a similar method or approach with someone from University Z, and they will want to collaborate with both of their institutional data. That's a simplified example. Yes.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments?
So James, I have a question, hypothetical, or maybe not so hypothetical. You've kind of described kind of the packaging of all this as a service that we might offer research faculty. Now, how might you sum up the advantages that this process presents to faculty who want to pursue multi-institutional research or multi-institutional scale research? Because faculty have, researchers have conducted research on a multi-institutional scale for a while, over and above maybe the time advantages. In other words, I do think Unizin can streamline, to the extent it can be streamlined, a lot of the administrative aspects of this. Are there any other advantages you see for faculty in working through this Unizin service and working with and through Unizin to conduct multi-institutional scale research in the learning sciences or with learning data?
Well, what comes to mind first, and you might be able to answer your own question better than I can, but it really allows us to work as a consortium and collaborate in ways, really mechanize the collaboration of consortium members in a way that I don't think would be possible without the consortium. What are your particular thoughts?
One of the ones that comes to mind is that we have a lot of folks at Unizin who understand the data well. And in the research projects that we've supported, not through this process, but through more ad hoc methods, the one thing that we could bring to the table was likely a deeper understanding of the data than was initially available to the researcher. So the researcher might come with an idea or a research question or a set of hypotheses, And then there's a feasibility question. You know, there's like a feasibility. And I would say that, so one of the advantages is that the faculty are likely going to understand their research goals and projects far better than anyone else on the Unizin side. But when it comes to the data and feasibility, we might be able to provide support there. You also mentioned the kind of consortium level advantages. And I don't think there has been a single research project that we've supported that was not that was just a one-off. Typically, I'm thinking of like Ben Motz's stuff on many classes. I'm thinking of the e-reader research at Iowa. These have been kind of term over term studies or multiple phases to the study. I'm thinking of library analytics as an example. And even if early on, there could be a feasibility challenge because let's say you need a particular data point out of a tool that is not, that is not available. Part of what Unizin can do is then go work with the vendor community to improve the instrumentation in the learning environment to be able to detect the data, the behaviors, the events that are necessary for some future. So there's, it has been helpful to take a tactical and strategic approach when we start working with researchers, because these research relationships haven't just been one-time encounters, haven't just been one time. They have the idea has been to establish relationships and support a research program. So I think those are two other advantages, is that our relationships with vendors, or at least tool providers, can create some advantages for multi-phase research projects where you need to extract data that might not be initially available.
Right. Yeah, and I think what you describe is some of the advantages that we've conveyed to other institutions in working with our data services team to tease out new ways of looking at data or new ways of drawing on other data or previous projects. All of that context in terms of the overarching research support and data services that we provide, that context is rich, and yes, that has a tremendous impact.
I feel like a lawyer. Never pose a question you don't already know the answer to.
I'm comfortable with your responses. Any other questions or comments? I know it's the waning hours of the second day, but all right. Well, Etienne, thank you very much for your questions and answers, and for facilitating this presentation. Much appreciated.
Yep. Thank you, James. Thank you, Jeff.
Everybody,
Thank you, everybody, for showing up.
Thanks
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.